go ahead and get started. Thanks for your patience. We just finished up on votes on the floor. Good afternoon and welcome to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission's hearing on how to strengthen multi-sectoral partnerships in the fight against human trafficking. I'd like to thank our distinguished experts for taking time out of their busy schedule and important work to testify before the Commission on this topic today. Trafficking in persons or human trafficking refers to the subjection of men, women, and children to compelled service for the purposes of exploitation. It's an issue that deeply concerns me and one in which I've been vigorously engaged since coming to Congress in efforts to work for lasting solutions. Trafficking occurs domestically within the territorial borders of a country, including the United States. It's also a cross-border and transnational phenomenon. Examples of human trafficking include trafficking for commercial sexual exploitation, including child sexual exploitation, forced labor, including bonded labor, involuntary, domestic servitude and forced child labor, and the unlawful recruitment and use of child soldiers. Reports suggest that human trafficking is the fastest growing criminal enterprise in the world, holding captive an estimated 21 million victims and contributing to a multi-billion-dollar criminal industry. It is a centuries-old problem that, despite international efforts, continues to occur in virtually every country in the world. My efforts have largely focused, but not exclusively, on ending sex trafficking with a specific focus on the demand for commercial sex. Evidence shows that where the demand for commercial sex flourishes, so does a thriving human trafficking industry. That's why I introduced H.R. 466, the Sex Trafficking Demand Reduction Act. This legislation holds nations accountable for serious and sustained efforts to fight human trafficking by compelling them to include measures to combat the demand for commercial sex as well. Since the Palermo Protocol in 2000, governmental, nonprofit, and private sector initiatives have made important strides against the global epidemic of human trafficking, but closer partnerships across these sectors are needed to increase their effectiveness. Different types of human rights abuses are manifested in various forms of trafficking, and different sectors address these through complementary approaches. The 3P paradigm of preventing the crime, protecting the victim, and prosecuting traffickers is a multi-pronged strategy implemented by sectors in different ways, depending on the context in which each operates. Greater communication, coordination, and information sharing among governments, businesses, and NGOs working to combat trafficking will serve the best interests of those trapped in this nefarious enterprise. My hope is that this hearing will help to facilitate that. Each of our experts here today are working across sectors with other anti-trafficking organizations and initiatives to end this violent form of modern slavery. I look forward to hearing how each sector is working together with the other to end trafficking and what more they need from each other to creatively strengthen their own unique anti-trafficking work and arrive at workable, permanent solutions. I'm also very interested to learn how Congress can better help facilitate this kind of cross-sectoral cooperation. Though we are all working to combat trafficking within our different contexts, our goals are the same. We must continue to increase our cooperation, collective effectiveness, and collaborative efforts in order to achieve lasting success. And proud to recognize great co-chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, Jim McGovern.
Well, thank you, and I want to thank my co-chair, Congressman Hultgren, for not only his leadership on this issue, but on so many issues concerning human rights. And I want to acknowledge the presence of Catherine Porter in the audience, who a long time ago, before this became the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, used to be the Human Rights Caucus, and she was one of the inspirations for that, so we're happy to see her here. And I want to welcome everybody to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing on multi-sectoral partnerships to combat human trafficking. And I want to add my thanks to our distinguished witnesses who are here. Thank you for your taking the time to share with us your knowledge and your recommendations. We appreciate your presence. Trafficking in persons, modern slavery, is a global scourge in which men, women, and children, as my colleague has stated, are subjected to compelled service for the purposes of exploitation. It involves recruitment, transportation, and harboring of persons by means of force, abduction, fraud, or deception. It is a moral failure and a grave violation of human rights. And unlike the slavery of the 18th and 19th centuries in the United States, trafficking is illegal here and around the world, but it persists in a variety of forms: commercial sex trafficking, forced labor, bonded labor, involuntary domestic servitude, the use of child soldiers, victimizing millions of people and contributing to a multi-billion-dollar criminal industry. The good news is that in our country and around the world over the last couple of decades, we're seeing real efforts to end human trafficking. The U.S. Congress, acting on a bipartisan basis, is part of that effort, beginning with the U.S. Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, and most recently H.R. 2200, the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Act, which passed the House in July. I am privileged to have co-sponsored both of these pieces of legislation. And past administrations, both Republicans and Democratic, have taken the trafficking issue seriously and worked to implement the 3P framework: prosecution, protection, and prevention. But the bad news is that trafficking continues, both within and across our borders. So we are here today to discuss what more can be done, and in particular, how to better coordinate efforts across all sectors: government, NGOs, and business. You know, back in 2009, when Secretary of State Hillary Clinton included the idea of a fourth P, partnership, as part of her rollout of the State Department's annual Trafficking in Persons report, in an op-ed in the Washington Post on the role of partnerships for anti-trafficking, Secretary Clinton wrote, and I quote, "To our strategy of prosecution, protection, and prevention, it's time to add a fourth P, partnerships. The criminal networks that enslave millions of people cross borders and span continents. Our response must do the same. The United States is committed to building partnerships with governments and organizations around the world, to finding new and more effective ways to take on the scourge of human trafficking. We want to support our partners in their effort and find ways to improve our own," end quote. Under the Obama administration, the role of partnerships expanded in U.S. policy to address human trafficking, and it is my hope that that approach will continue under the current administration. So today, I look forward to hearing how we can further strengthen this fourth P, with an eye toward the day when no human being will be able to enslave another. And I thank you, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Co-Chairman McGovern. We're going to have two panels this afternoon. Panel one, I'm very grateful and look forward to hearing the testimony of Laura Spott-Rundlet, serves as Acting Deputy Director for the U.S. Department of State's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. With that, would recognize you for your testimony. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Congressman Hultgren, Congressman McGovern, members of the Commission. It is an honor to appear before you today and to be joined by my colleagues on the second panel, all of whom I know well and greatly respect. Thank you for inviting all of us here to discuss this important topic. As members of the Commission and colleagues in this room are all well aware, human trafficking, also known as modern slavery, is a truly immense problem. It devastates lives of millions around the world each day and inflicts untold harm on families and communities, labor markets, the rule of law, and public safety and national security everywhere. Since the adoption of the UN Palermo Protocol and the passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in 2000, major strides have indeed been made in combating this global crime. Based on these instruments, the paradigm of prosecution, protection, and prevention, or the 3 Ps, has served as the framework for guiding both governments and organizations around the world in their efforts to fight human trafficking. My office in the State Department, the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, or TIP office, uses a range of tools to advance the 3P paradigm worldwide. And we do also rely on partnerships, or the 4th P, to facilitate progress across those 3 Ps by enlisting all segments of society in this human rights cause. Indeed, to address such a large-scale and complex challenge, we must collaborate with a wide array of partners, including survivors of human trafficking, as both the drivers and the consequences of this crime intersect with other priority areas, from healthcare and law enforcement to global supply chains and national security. But we in government simply cannot fight human trafficking alone. That is why the TIP office supports the important work of our partners by engaging in strategic diplomacy, targeting foreign assistance, supporting the coordination of federal anti-trafficking policies, and engaging civil society and the private sector in key partnerships. We work to make connections and facilitate collaboration between the different sectors in an effort to better tackle the crime together. So today, I just wanted to briefly touch on several important examples of these efforts of the TIP office. First, we're grateful for our partnership with Congress. Of course, Congress has played such an enormous role in raising the profile of the issue in the United States and abroad, beginning with the passage of the TVPA and the creation of our office in 2000, but continuing to the present. We thank you for your dedication and support, and I do look forward to discussing ways we can partner and improve in the future. Second, our bilateral partnerships are central to our work. It is well known that the Trafficking in Persons report is the TIP Office's primary diagnostic tool. It guides our engagement with foreign governments on their efforts to combat human trafficking. But as other governments are increasingly committing resources to address this issue globally, our bilateral engagement has also evolved to include working to align, coordinate, and deconflict assistance efforts. So for example, we are consulting regularly with the government of the United Kingdom on a range of issues, including efforts championed by Prime Minister May, who has made combating modern slavery her top human rights priority. We engage with Canada and Mexico through the North American Leaders Summit to share information and better identify where we can coordinate our efforts. And we're also coordinating closely with the government of Australia on its anti-trafficking programs, especially in Southeast Asia. Third, our interagency partnerships are also critical to everything we do, given the complexity of the challenge and how interconnected human trafficking is to other issues like irregular migration and terrorism and violent extremism. In the foreign assistance realm, we have developed a planning process to better coordinate our anti-trafficking and other programming within the State Department and also with USAID and the Department of Labor so that we don't duplicate efforts or work at cross purposes, and increasingly so that we can align and complement each other's programs. We also rely on our interagency partnerships here at home to ensure that we're doing as much as we can with the resources we have. The Secretary of State chairs the President's Interagency Task Force on Human Trafficking, which is a task force that works year-round across 15 government agencies to coordinate not only on grant making, but also on victim services, procurement and supply chains, public awareness and outreach, to name a few. Fourth, we collaborate extensively with NGOs, including the members of the second panel, on all aspects of our work, particularly in international programs. By partnering with NGOs in the field, we're able to maximize the impact that that their regional and subject matter expertise brings. As an example, our office has a Child Protection Compact partnership in the Philippines, and we plan to partner with the International Justice Mission, one of our longstanding NGO partners, and together we plan to strengthen current efforts of the government and civil society in the Philippines to prosecute and convict traffickers involved in online sexual exploitation of children. We are also improving an online platform called responsiblesourcingtool.org in partnership with the NGO Verite. This platform is a tool for government procurement officials and also federal contractors and other companies to understand the risks of human trafficking in their supply chains and to develop strategies to prevent it. Fifth, we engage multilaterally, including through the United Nations, the International Labor Organization, and numerous regional bodies. These organizations help drive political will and action to combat human trafficking through the development of international norms and also through the provision of technical assistance on the ground. We have a long-standing partnership, for example, with the International Organization on Migration to provide emergency assistance to victims of sex and labor trafficking outside the United States. Services such as shelter, food, medical and psychosocial care, legal assistance, and reintegration support. We also work closely with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe to prevent trafficking in government supply chains and are supporting their development of model guidelines for government procurement. Sixth, private sector partnerships. They've also been an important part of our work. In 2013, our office has partnered with New Perimeter, which is the nonprofit affiliate of the law firm DLA Piper, and we're working to increase the availability of pro bono legal resources and tools to support survivors in underserved regions around the world. And we've also collaborated with business coalitions and industry associations, including the Electronic Industry Citizenship Coalition, to maximize our collective outreach and influence the prevention of forced labor in global supply chains. Lastly, a consistent unifying factor throughout all of our engagements and perhaps the most important partnership of all, is our commitment to a victim-centered approach and a dedication to meaningful partnerships with survivors. The TIP office supports the work of the U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking, which was created as part of the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act. The 11 survivor leaders who make up the council provide advice and recommendations to the President's Interagency Task Force on the formulation and execution of federal anti-trafficking policies. I'd like to close with one of our newest and most innovative partnerships, the Program to End Modern Slavery, another example of the important support of Congress. The program aims to increase U.S. and global funding for transformational programs to reduce the prevalence of modern slavery in specific countries and regions. It will begin with a partnership between the United States and an NGO implementer and grow to include other governments, private sector donors, and many more organizations on the ground carrying out programs and measuring results. It is a prime example of the innovative multi-sectoral approaches we all must take moving forward to combat modern slavery around the world. I've just provided a snapshot of many of our partnerships, ones that we rely on to more effectively combat slavery, modern slavery, excuse me. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. Thanks for your testimony. I've got just a few questions, and then I hand it over to our co-chairman. Thank you for highlighting so many of the areas where partnerships are working, where you were seeing some impact. Wonder if you could just highlight maybe what you're most encouraged about out of that list, and then if you see some areas where we could do better, where the federal government has so many important roles in this that no one else can do, but we certainly need the help of these outside entities in other countries as well. So I wonder if there is anything that comes to mind of where you think we need more work and more effort, and is there anything kind of standing in the way of the State Department being able to advance partnerships?
Thanks for that question. All of the work that we do in the office, I think it's fair to say, is quite challenging. It's an enormous task. However, I do feel that partnerships are useful in supplementing the areas of work where the government has its own mandate individually, and also perhaps areas where the government isn't necessarily able to devote sufficient resources. I think all these programs that I've talked about and others that I haven't, they all have challenges in terms of implementation and evaluation of success. But their success really has been demonstrated over the years, the growing level of engagement across all sectors, not just in the United States, but around the world. It's actually become quite a challenge just keep up with the amount of work that's been happening around the world on this issue. So that's one of our primary challenges, actually, is making sure that all the efforts are coordinated and working and striving toward the same outcomes instead of working at cross purposes. But let me highlight the Child Protection Compact partnerships as an area that's particularly that we expect to bear fruit. These are negotiated partnerships that we work on with government prior to investing foreign assistance dollars. So it's a new approach for the office. It's a couple years old. We have 3 Child Protection Compact partnerships that have been signed. And our work begins by in-depth relationships with that foreign government, getting to know how they operate, getting to know how their interagency works, where their gaps are, where their strengths are, and then working through a competitive process to find implementers on the ground that are able to address the gaps and that are willing to work in a collaborative way with the government. So it really is an approach that we're very excited about, and it's early in the process, but it's really one of, I think, our most exciting projects right now that's underway.
That's great, thanks. I wonder, are there challenges with communication, with getting information back and forth, especially as we talk about children and other things? Is there hurdles or obstacles with the State Department being able to share information in these specific circumstances? And then I wonder, you talk about working with other governments. What's your sense of the willingness for them to want to see change here? Is it pretty much universal that they recognize the problems, or is there some pushback still in some of these places of maybe not wanting to admit the seriousness of the problem in their countries?
To your second half of your question, I don't think we have received pushback in that way. I think the governments that we're working with are very interested and aligned in the goals. We do have a process for country selection that is fairly rigorous, so in some ways that's to be expected because we're picking countries that have the political will to do this, and also the sort of the more across society, not just within government, so the will of actors locally to do that. So we have not experienced that pushback. I think the challenge is more in resources and just making sure that the countries that we have chosen have significant problems, and they're large countries. And so we've, for example, had to focus our programs in certain regions, not an entire country. So there's limits to how much we can do at once, but not right now from pushback from government. And your first question about sharing information, no, I don't think there are any sensitivities there. I think we are quite open to briefing on the Child Protection Compact partnerships.
One more thing, if I may, and then I'll hand it over to Congressman McGovern. But grateful again for the State Department's work with the Trafficking in Persons report. I still feel like that is so vital and really does have an impact that countries are paying attention to what we're stating in that. So thanks for your work and others' work on that. Wonder to what extent are partnerships aligned in improving poor performing countries in the TIP report? So they might recognize the challenge, wanting to improve, but are they willing to also have the partnership relationships to try and improve, as you mentioned in my last question, ongoing challenges, resources. But it sounds, I think there are partners who are wanting to help, and whether that's with resources or people or efforts or things like that. Is there any pushback from these countries? Are there ways, again, that we can be encouraging the TIP report and partnerships to be working together to see improvement of poor performing countries?
I think I would say there's so many countries that we cover in the report that it's hard to provide one answer. I think there are a wide array of countries that we have very active relationships with, both in our office and at Post overseas, in having a dialogue about the recommendations in the report, also in targeting our foreign assistance for certain countries that may need help in certain areas. So we have a very coordinated approach to sort of executing the recommendations in our report in a way where we're engaging with the foreign government. And I think we have a lot of success with a handful of countries. I'm not in a position to name any of those right now, but I do think that it's an area, even where countries are not as engaged as we would like them to be, it's again an area where our office would be happy to have a follow-up conversation with you or the commission on some of those specific country questions.
That'd be great. Thank you so much. I'm grateful to yield to Co-Chairman.
I can't. There we go. I just have a couple of questions. And first of all, thank you for being here, and thank you for the work that you and your office does. We are grateful, and look, as I mentioned in my opening statement, this commitment to trying to combat human trafficking has spanned many administrations. I mean, Democrat and Republican as well. So but we have a new administration, and the previous administration, the Obama administration, explicitly included attention to partnerships in its approach to combating trafficking. I'm getting from what you're saying is that emphasis will continue. But are there, is there anything, or will there be anything different? Is there any new approaches that are being contemplated in this administration that we haven't pursued in the past, or are we continuing along the same path?
Well, I can say that combating human trafficking is certainly a very high priority for both the White House and the State Department. The Secretary is committed to ensuring that human trafficking is a priority for the department and that our office maintains strong leadership. We have continued to work across the 3 Ps and across the functional areas in our office, whether it's tip report and bilateral engagement, international programs, partnerships, our work continues. So we haven't had a change of course.
Well, I'm
press
happy,
on.
I'm happy to hear about the commitment, because there certainly is that commitment here in Congress. And I raised the issue because when the president's budget initially came out, I saw lots of reductions in the State Department's budget. I was trying to pinpoint whether any of that would have impacted your office in particular, or whether there had been any discussion about reductions in your office or your capacity to do your job. I mean, again, partnerships are important, and NGO and businesses are important partners to combat trafficking. But it is governments that have the state duty to protect human rights, and I'm just trying to understand if the president's budget had been enacted, how would that have impacted our efforts, our anti-trafficking efforts? Because certainly those reductions would have to come from somewhere, and unless you guys were told there'd be no reductions, I don't know.
I'm not aware of any such conversations. We are, our office maintains its high level of engagement, and the secretary has committed to making sure our office can have the resources that it needs to continue to do the work that we do.
Yeah, I would just, and again, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, I would just simply say that if that budget had been enacted, I'm not sure you would have had the resources to be able to do the job that you all want to do. And I think, and I think Congress is coming to the rescue, both the House and the Senate. But I just point that out because the resources are vitally important in order for you to be able to effectively do the work that I know we all want you to do and that you want to do as well. Going back to what my colleague had asked about, whether there are, whether the communications are all, are working well within the administration and other departments and agencies. I guess I just ask, I mean, is, and other than funds and resources, are there additional things that Congress can do to support the State Department's anti-trafficking efforts at this point in time? I mean, and by that I mean, are there gaps in the tools available to state that should be addressed through legislation? Is there anything that we need to do legislatively that would basically help us be even more effective in the battle to combat trafficking?
I think that the attention and the support that Congress has paid to this issue and the collaboration that our office has had with different committees and different members' offices, including throughout the past year, have been very useful and to us, and we carry on and continue to do the work that we've been doing since I've joined the office years ago. So I think there's always more that all of us can do, but we have the resources that we have right now to carry out the activities that we've been doing all along.
No, and again, I would just close with this. I appreciate the list that you produce, because I think sometimes shaming is an important and powerful tool for countries that are not doing enough to combat this issue. But yet there are still these countries that we have relations with and we do business with, and so sometimes shaming in and of itself is not enough. I think as time goes on, and I think this administration decides how it's going to approach the world, I would just say that there may be some cases where I think with certain countries we may need to step it up a little bit in terms of going beyond just the list, and the current pressures that we have in place. So, but again, I appreciate the work you're doing. I'm glad that it looks like, it seems at this particular point, like in terms of budgets, that the State Department budget is going to not be decimated, and I think that's good news for the whole world. but it's especially good news for the work that you're doing, which is so vital. So I thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Acting Deputy Director Renlet. Appreciate your testimony and answering our questions. Thank you so much. We'll transition to our second panel now.
Thank you.
Welcome to our second panel. So glad you're here. Let me introduce you, and then I'll have you each give your testimony if you would, and then we'll ask some questions if that's all right. First, grateful to have in your, could you help me with your last name? Busquets, good. Mr. Carlos Busquets, Director of Public Policy for the Electronic Industry Citizenship Coalition. Thank you so much. Also, Tim Gearing, who's Policy Director for International Justice Mission. And then is it Anik Fabry, Senior Associate Anti-Trafficking Campaign, Human Rights First. Thank you all so much for being here. Mr. Busquets.
Thank you very much, Congressman Holmgren.
Can you push on the...
Yeah.
Congressman Holmgren, Congressman McGovern.
Are you on? Yeah. Okay. Is there a green light?
The green light's on.
Okay,
Yes.
good.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to be here with you today and to testify on this important hearing on this important issue. My name is Carlos Busquets. I am the Director of Public Policy for the Electronic Industry Citizenship Coalition, or the EICC for short. The EICC is a nonprofit coalition of leading companies collaborating to improve social and environmental performance in their supply chains. EICC was founded in 2004 by forward-thinking companies that wanted to protect the rights and well-being of workers in the electronic supply chain. Today, the EICC is comprised of more than 110 companies across electronics, automotive, retail, toys, and other sectors, with a combined annual revenue greater than $4.75 trillion, millions of workers, and thousands of suppliers, a sizable industry footprint. The EICC has been actively helping its members prevent, detect, and address forced labor and human trafficking, both in their own operations and their supply chains. Our members commit and are held accountable to a common code of conduct and utilize a range of training and assessment tools to support continuous improvement. The EICC's code of conduct explicitly bans trafficked and forced labor. However, eradicating in the global supply chains, as we've seen today, is a challenge. According to the International Labor Organization, approximately 21 million people worldwide are working in situations of forced labor. Other estimates are even larger. Exploitative force, fraud, debt bondage, or other coercion. Workers in many industries and many regions throughout the world are vulnerable to these conditions that create forced labor. Companies have a moral imperative to act, financial incentives to do so, not only because of the risk of their operations, reputations, and in some cases sales, but also because it's the right thing to do. Moreover, awareness of these issues among companies across industries is at an all-time high, thanks to increased scrutiny and pressure from government regulators, non-governmental organizations, customers, institutional investors, and the media. When it comes to this issue, there is virtually no daylight between the positions of civil society and those of the member companies in the EICC. All agree that forced labor is an affront to human rights, and no company wants it in their supply chain. This is why eliminating the conditions that contribute to forced labor has been one of our highest priorities since our founding. But supply chains are complex and often include hundreds of thousands of foreign migrant workers who seek to make a better life for themselves and their families. Sadly, some are subject to high recruitment fees, personal debt, complicated recruitment practices, a lack of transparency about their eventual working conditions, and inadequate legal conditions in the countries in which they work. All of these conditions can lead to trafficked and forced labor. For example, in 2014, a report sponsored by the U.S. Department of Labor and Verite found that 1 in 3 foreign migrant workers surveyed in Malaysian electronic factories were in a condition of forced labor. The report concluded that factors contributing to this included reliance on third-party labor agents for recruitment, management and employment of foreign workers, unlawful passport retention, high and hidden recruitment fees leading to indebtedness, inadequate legal protections. The report triggered a series of groundbreaking changes at the EICC, helping us take the lead to address these issues, including strengthening our code of conduct in 2015 to ensure that workers shall not be required to pay employer or agent recruitment fees, no unreasonable restriction on workers' freedom of movement, including retention of passports. Workers are provided with written employment agreement in their native language prior to departure from their country of origin, and they're free to leave their employment at any time. We are proud to have been one of the first industry groups to adopt these policies. To help implement these changes, we are now in the process of developing a series of advanced due diligence standards, tools, and programs. These include standards and educational offerings to drive corporate accountability and due diligence, specialized risk assessments to help identify forced labor in factories and among labor agents, a supplemental forced labor validated audit program geared to identify and correcting forced labor in the workplace, a worker grievance mechanism to assist workers through the hiring and employment process, and finally, labor agent training and certification, what we believe is the critical piece to address the root cause of forced labor and trafficking. We strongly agree with the theme of this hearing on the need to strengthen partnerships, including within and across sectors. While the EICC has been at the forefront of addressing forced labor in global supply chains, in order to accelerate change and drive labor market transformation, we believe that due diligence must be harmonized across multiple industries that share recruitment corridors or channels. Guiding principles on forced labor are well established. However, solutions are fragmented across industries and geographies and only address certain aspects or specific points in a worker's journey. To address these gaps, earlier this summer, the EICC launched the Responsible Labor Initiative, or the RLI, a multi-industry, multi-stakeholder effort focused on ensuring that the rights of workers vulnerable to forced labor in global supply chains are consistently respected and promoted. Our solutions, or RLI solutions, are based on these EICC standards and programs I just mentioned, and we are now in discussions to extend this to other industries, including retail, consumer goods, hospitality, and construction, just to name a few. Working with multiple industries across the supply chain will help enable us to identify important trends and best practices, raise awareness, and convene diverse groups facing similar challenges. We believe this approach is particularly relevant as unscrupulous behavior on the part of some employers and third-party employment agencies can exacerbate vulnerability to exploitation. But the system in which foreign workers are recruited, placed, and managed is complex enough to create vulnerability even in the absence of willful intent to exploit. We note that the labor agent or broker is the quote-unquote choke point in driving systemic change across recruitment corridor. There are a number of developing systems, such as the International Organization on Migration's IRIS system and the Fair Hiring Initiative, that aim to certify quote-unquote responsible labor agents in key recruitment corridors. While the EICC and the RLI endorse and collaborate with these organizations, we are also working on a labor agency maturity model to help prepare labor brokers and recruitment agencies to meet our stringent standards, offer a path to certification, and communicate which agencies are on a path to responsible practices. Agents will apply for the developing level by being pre-screened, attending training, conducting a forced labor self-assessment, and demonstrating that they're meeting a majority of the provisions in our protocol. These steps would be checked by a third party, and the agents would need to commit to a no recruitment fees policy. After achieving this level, the agent can meet the next level by having an on-site forced labor audit and completing all corrective actions to demonstrate compliance. This will then lead to certification by approved third parties on an ongoing basis. We have already held a number of preliminary engagements, focusing initially on the Nepal-Malaysia recruitment corridor. Indeed, we're having some series of events next week in Kuala Lumpur, and we're going to continue to look at other corridors as this initiative grows. As you can see, industry, as represented by the EICC and the RLI, is trying to root out trafficking and forced labor in their supply chains. However, industry cannot do this alone, and the theme of partnerships is so critical that you've raised. Only by working collectively with government, civil society, can we truly make a difference. Thus, as this Commission and Congress considers possible efforts related to these issues, we suggest prioritization around 3 key points. Build on existing programs, practices, and tools and leverage them to scale solutions. Strengthen public-private partnerships, particularly around key migration corridors. And of course, engage foreign governments in both sending and receiving countries in this fight. The EICC, via the RLI, stands ready to work proactively with you to address this complicated issue. Thank you again for the invitation to testify today, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Busquets. Thanks for being here. Next, Mr. Gearing.
Congressman Holgren, Mr. McGovern, and other members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today on the issue of trafficking in persons, and specifically how civil society and country governments and the private sector can work in collaboration, as each plays a distinct but critical role in addressing this issue. And also, I'd just like to thank your staff. I've worked with each of a number of them over the years on several different issues. They've been extremely helpful to IJM, and they represent each of your offices well. I'm honored to be here on behalf of International Justice Mission, a global human rights agency that provides direct services to victims and survivors of human trafficking and other violent abuses. Over the past 20 years, we've provided relief to over 44,000 people from violence by collaborating with police, courts, prosecutors, judges, and social workers around the world to rescue victims, hold perpetrators accountable, and restore survivors. And today's hearing on multi-sector approaches to address human trafficking is an apt one. At IJM, we're very encouraged by the partnerships that are developed between country governments, civil society, and the private sector. The most effective way to tackle this problem of trafficking in persons and modern slavery is to do it together, and we are delighted to have partners in this fight. The UN Guiding Principles on Business Human Rights provides a helpful delineation of the responsibilities of governments and the private sector in addressing human rights abuses, including trafficking and forced labor. Governments have the, quote, state duty to protect human rights, and companies have the, quote, responsibility to respect human rights. We see this as a critical distinction. While the private sector can and should do more to ensure that their business practices are not using or contributing to the use of exploitative labor, it is the country government's sole responsibility to enforce the rule of law. Allow me to describe how International Justice Mission, an NGO, partners with the governments in the countries where we work and in the private sector to help them fulfill these responsibilities. In each of the countries where IJM works, the public justice system, the police, the courts, the judges often fail to protect the most vulnerable populations from violence. And indeed, this is true for most of the world's poorest populations. According to the UN Commission on Legal Empowerment of the Poor, most of the world's poorest people, a stunning 4 billion, live far from the law's protection. And not only are the world's poorest not protected by their police or court systems, they often actively avoid these systems because they're so abusive or unresponsive. Under-resourced, under-trained, and corrupt law enforcement does not or cannot arrest and charge criminals or gather evidence. Trials move at a glacier pace, files are lost, and victims are unnecessarily and repeatedly traumatized throughout the court process. Social services are often under-resourced, untrained, and uncoordinated. The dysfunction of the developing world public justice system creates an environment of impunity in which criminals know they will not be held accountable for trafficking or enslaving others. These systems are completely void of the deterrent effect that an effective criminal justice should have, and thus crimes like human trafficking flourishes and goes unchecked. As a remedy to this dysfunction, IJM's teams of lawyers, investigators, and social workers partners with law enforcement and judicial authorities on individual cases. For example, our investigators work alongside police units to assist in investigations, intervention and victim rescue, and evidence collection. Our lawyers then help public prosecutors to prepare and try the case to hold perpetrators accountable, and our social workers will ensure that after the rescue, survivors have the aftercare services that they need. In doing all of this, IJM's team is able to provide rescue and relief to victims of the crime, while also developing relationships of trust and goodwill with local public justice system officials. This ground-level support to move real criminal cases through the public justice system also serves as a diagnostic tool, identifying exactly where the gaps and the blockages exist. This detailed understanding of the system, where the system fails victims and survivors, then allows us to design larger-scale programs to address these gaps, to ensure that the system can function effectively and sustainably on its own. Improving the performance of the entire justice system benefits all people who are victimized by the crime, not just IJM clients. And moreover, it creates a deterrent effect so that vulnerable populations are not exploited in the first place. And from IJM's perspective, there is no substitute for developing an effective criminal justice response to the criminal act of trafficking in persons, but there are ways that the private sector can support these efforts. In recent years, investigative journalists have brought the world's attention to the issue of forced labor in global supply chains. Major corporations, many with household name recognition, bear the weight of opprobrium when trafficking and forced labor is exposed. Dozens of industries have been outed: textiles, chocolate, electronics, seafood, agriculture, metals, bricks, flowers. And while these abuses have certainly existed in these areas for a very long time, recent attention has been very helpful in encouraging corporations to do more. No one should question the responsibility of the private sector to do their utmost to identify and clean their supply chains of exploitative labor. And some responsible corporations are already partnering with other excellent civil society groups to improve their business practices in strengthening internal audits, requiring responsible recruitment, facilitating safe migration, and developing other safe labor practices. All of these are extremely important. But the private sector, by its very definition, cannot enforce a country's laws or hold criminals accountable. And these approaches on their own, without an effective law enforcement response, are unlikely to reduce forced labor in global supply chains, because it's not just a business problem or a migration problem or a labor rights issue. It is all of those things. But it's also a violent crime in which there's massive profitability and total impunity. Protecting workers from harm and exploitation and deterring crime requires that corporate stakeholders, including investors, importers, shareholders, and retailers, know the landscape of where they are sourcing their supply. And a crucial element of this landscape is the will and capacity of local and national authorities to predictably enforce their laws. Solutions that try to work around broken government systems that aren't enforcing laws won't be able to create the enabling, transparent, and accountable system needed for businesses to operate overseas responsibly. And they won't be able to protect people from exploitation or contribute to crime reduction. The private sector has the opportunity to be an agent of positive change in combating trafficking and forced labor. Corporations should use their enormous leverage in the countries where they are doing business to encourage the government to carry out its responsibility to enforce their laws against trafficking and forced labor. And corporations should prioritize investment in developing functional law enforcement capabilities, such as specialized anti-trafficking police units, special public prosecutors, and legal assistance for exploited workers. And IJM is very excited to announce such a partnership with the private sector. We are partnering with the Walmart Foundation with support from the U.S. Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons to address forced labor in the Thai fishing industry. Our office in Bangkok will support the Royal Thai government to stop the use of forced labor in the fishing industry by building the capacity of the justice system to sustainably and professionally enforce anti-trafficking laws, hold local criminals accountable in order to end impunity, and increase deterrence, and provide restorative support to survivors. We're seeing receptivity from the Thai government. They're proud of the efforts that they've taken over the last 18 months to shore up laws and policies, develop cross-border agreements, and show their commitment to addressing the problem. But they also agree that they have not yet implemented a comprehensive law enforcement response. So they agreed to collaborate with us to build up the capacity of their justice system. There's still much work to be done by all parties involved, but this is the type of collaboration between governments and corporations and civil society that is critical to holistically addressing trafficking and forced labor. The criminal act of the enslavement of other people for the purpose of profit is an enormously complex issue. Combating it is difficult and not yet perfected. And IJM still has much to learn from our friends and partners in this space that are addressing the downstream effects of impunity and broken public justice systems. But after almost 20 years of providing services to victims and survivors alongside our government partners, a few lessons learned have become crystal clear. Victims can be rescued, police can improve, survivors can be restored, and justice systems can be transformed to be effective and reliable institutions of protection. To underscore this point, the best way to address human trafficking is through partnerships between civil society, the private sector, and governments. And it's by coordinating and complementing efforts that the greater collective impact can be achieved and systems can be transformed to prevent crime and protect vulnerable populations. And it is my hope that all of our partners, whether a donor government like the United States or the private sector actors or other civil society groups, regardless of their approach or distinct role, will recognize the necessity of working alongside partner governments, despite their shortcomings and challenges, to protect people from exploitation and demonstrably reduce the crime. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Next, recognize Anik, and I should have asked last name, is it Fabre or
Fabry.
Fabry? So Ms. Fabry, if you could go next. Thank you.
Thank you, Co-Chairman and members of the Commission, for the opportunity to engage in this important conversation today. It's a privilege to get to do so alongside colleagues and friends on both panels today, so thank you. At Human Rights First, our mission is to foster American global leadership on human rights. Our country is strongest when our actions match our ideals. For nearly 40 years, we have worked to ensure that the United States acts as a beacon on human rights in a world that needs American leadership. Human trafficking is one of the clearest illustrations of this. Millions around the world are enslaved. The parasitic perpetrators of slavery target the most vulnerable among us, violating the most fundamental human rights. Our anti-trafficking work is focused on stemming the massive profits amounting to an estimated $150 billion annually that fuel the perpetrators and on ending the virtual impunity in which they operate. We are pressing the U.S. government and business community to lead the fight against human trafficking because American leadership is essential in engaging the international community and in developing essential multilateral and multi-sector partnerships. Our anti-trafficking work is informed by our campaign ambassadors, a diverse group of leaders in business, government, military, civil society, and academia who have devoted their expertise to combat this problem. This hearing and the work of the Lantos Commission in drawing attention to the need for a multi-sector collaborative effort is exactly the same approach we take. Congress has taken steps to prevent the U.S. from supporting slave labor and has passed legislation to combat human trafficking within our borders and abroad. But without proper enforcement, training, resources, and collaboration by the government, private sector, and civil society, we will see this vicious cycle of profit and crime continue. In 2016, there were 9,071 trafficking convictions globally, an improvement over the previous year's 6,615, but still a drop in the bucket when we consider the estimated 20.9 million individuals suffering at the hands of traffickers annually. One partnership that has been successful in increasing accountability for perpetrators and securing justice for victims here in this country is the Department of Justice-led Anti-Trafficking Coordination Teams, or also known as the ACT teams. This effort, coordinated by the Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit, prioritizes coordination between the Departments of Labor, Homeland Security, Justice, and the FBI. By coordinating across agencies, these teams are able to streamline resources needed to identify, investigate, and prosecute human trafficking cases. The first ACT teams were piloted from 2012 to 2013 and produced an 86% increase in convictions of human trafficking defendants, compared to an only 14% increase outside of the ACT team districts. The United States must lead by example by increasing accountability for traffickers through strategies that have been most effective. We've seen these ACT team districts and other areas with good coordination between federal agencies, local law enforcement, and victim service providers have real success. Their focus and partnerships have allowed for essential sharing of information and expertise during the investigation and prosecutorial phases, which has resulted in the filing of more cases and the ability to take on more complex cases. These teams have also worked transnationally. Since 2009, DOJ has led a bilateral enforcement initiative with Mexico to combat trans-border trafficking. Similar to the ACT team structure, DOJ, DHS, and Mexican authorities collaborate to streamline investigations and to dismantle key trafficking networks that operate between Mexico and the U.S. Since 2009, over 170 defendants have been prosecuted in the U.S., and 30 associated defendants were prosecuted in Mexico as a result of this partnership. Identifying potential cases of trafficking can also be greatly enhanced through partnerships with the private sector, like the Bankers Alliance Against Trafficking. The alliance was established in 2013 through a partnership between the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, the Thomson Reuters Foundation, and a group of the largest banks in the country. Collaborating with law enforcement and NGOs, 9 financial institutions developed 27 indicators that, when taken together, can help identify transactions that are highly at risk for trafficking. Not only does this data help law enforcement identify cases that might have gone otherwise unnoticed, but it can also help prosecutors build cases against traffickers without having to rely as heavily on victim testimony. This model of successful collaboration between the business community and law enforcement demonstrates that companies with access to data and employees well-positioned to identify potential instances of trafficking can greatly enhance efforts to end modern-day slavery. One area that needs stronger partnerships is around enforcement of the Tariff Act ban on products imported with forced labor, products produced with forced labor. Last year, Congress took action that has the potential to substantially decrease the market for slave labor by globally closing the consumptive demand loophole, which for over 85 years allowed the importation of slave-made goods if demand in the U.S. exceeded domestic production. We estimate that the United States imports over $142 billion worth of products made with forced labor, yet only 4 shipments were held at the border in the year and a half that followed passage of the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act, when the loophole was eliminated. Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, is the agency tasked with enforcement. Since this bill passed last year, it added a forced labor-focused working group to their Commercial Customs Operations Advisory Committee, which advises the Secretaries of the Department of Treasury and Homeland Security on commercial operations of CBP, including issues such as trade enforcement. This group includes importers, custom brokers, companies, and for the first time, NGOs, including Human Rights First. CBP has also created a separate working group of civil society organizations to engage CBP and other relevant agencies to promote public and government agency awareness and provide input on the forced labor enforcement processes. Human Rights First is also an active participant in this working group. Coordinating the agencies that work on forced labor, both in terms of prevention and enforcement here in the U.S. and overseas, is also critical to achieving the goal of this law. This requires one central office to be in charge of synchronizing these efforts. The White House National Security Council is ideally situated to facilitate this interagency process and to ensure that the enforcement agencies are meeting Congress's intention for the statute, that they have the resources necessary to fully enforce the law and are doing so in a timely way. Additionally, there needs to be clear and transparent information sharing for partnerships to work effectively. CBP has provided limited and often confusing guidance on what evidentiary standards it is using to respond to allegations or to self-initiate investigations. The law requires only reasonable suspicion for CBP to respond to an allegation, and the burden to prove that the goods are not made with forced labor falls to the importer. Just looking at the Department of Labor list of goods made with forced or child labor and recent news articles, there are numerous imported goods within which CBP should have reasonable suspicion. In addition, NGOs that are on the ground in countries where forced labor is occurring and global supply chains are a good source for flagging trouble spots that should be investigated. Congress should press CBP to self-initiate investigations when its reporting or reporting of partner agencies and NGOs indicate that there is reasonable suspicion. Congress should also ask CBP to clarify its evidentiary standards required to open an investigation so that multi-sector partners that can help provide information critical to enforcing the statute can be most effective. Lastly, if we effectively enforce the ban on products made with forced labor, then other countries are likely to receive those banned goods, particularly Canada, because of its proximity. The U.S. government should encourage other governments to adopt similar laws to ensure that the global market is closing to slave labor. Efforts to end the U.S. role in the perpetuation of this crime are critical. This committee has taken an important step in shining the light on the essential need for collective action. The scope of this problem demands that we tackle it in every sector. What can Congress do? Congress should help lead the way by pressing the private sector to act aggressively to root out slave labor in their own supply chains, creating a level playing field for responsible businesses, ensuring that all levels of government and law enforcement have sufficient resources and are working collaboratively, engaging the civil society activists who are on the front lines of this fight, engaging survivors who bring essential expertise in identifying where and why trafficking is thriving and how best to fight it, and while pressing other countries to do their part, continuing to raise the bar on our own leadership as a nation. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. So grateful to have Commissioner Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee from Houston with us today. I know she's got another commitment with the Budget Committee, but want to recognize her for a statement and any questions she might have.
I will yield and not ask any questions. I'll yield to both my chair and co-chair, but I want to make an important point. First of all, I want to thank the witnesses, and I truly believe that we do have it in our heart and in our capacity to be stronger in the United States against the scourge and the dastardly actions of human trafficking. Just wanted to put on the record, traffickers make $150 billion annually, with 20.9 million people worldwide victimized by human trafficking. I know those numbers, someone may have a higher number or a lower number, and it's estimated that $142 billion worth of products imported in the United States may have been involved with victims of human trafficking. And it's shameful to even imagine that in the tragedy and travesty of Hurricane Harvey, that the human trafficking business would, one, take advantage and, one, be thriving. So I want to at least read this headline, Human Trafficking, Even Bigger Concern in Houston After Hurricane Harvey. We now know that we have Hurricane Irma, and what opportunities, unfortunately, dastardly opportunities will take place. The mayor of the city of Houston, since Hurricane Harvey, Mayor Sylvester Turner, launched an initiative to combat a potential spike in human trafficking throughout the recovering city. In Houston alone, from December 2007 to June 15th, there were 717 cases of human trafficking. We've held a hearing in Houston. I do want to compliment the faith organizations, police, sheriff. They all are converging on really working to stomp out, to be aware of. And so I'd like to join the commission in thanking them for this hearing, and as well joining them with some of the requests that have been made about identification and CBP. I want to take note of the program at Homeland Security that trains flight attendants. I think we need to ensure the funding of that program and more airlines participating and training their flight attendants. So let me thank you all very much. I will yield back and ask unanimous consent for both my statement and this article from Patch about human trafficking, even bigger concern in Houston after Hurricane Harvey. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Without objection, that will be made part of the record. Can I recognize you first for questions if you have some?
Sure.
And then I'll wrap up.
Fabulous. All right, there we go. Thank you all very much, not only for your testimony, but for the incredible work that you're doing. And this is obviously a terrible situation that we still have to confront. Mr. Busquets, when I think about the potential partners in the commercial sector to combat trafficking, in addition to businesses, unions come to mind. Can you comment on any experience IECC may have in partnering with unions in anti-trafficking efforts?
Sure. Thank you, Congressman, for that question. Clearly, for us, stakeholder engagement or stakeholder efforts are critical to address that, especially when we're looking at markets where we may not have full information. So I can tell you very closely, we work with civil society and trade unions included in two ways, not just in defining the normative plane we work on. For example, our code of conduct is updated every 3 years, and it brings in input from stakeholders, including trade union confederations, actually the government as well as civil society, but also on the ground locally. We, through some of the local offices we have in places like Malaysia, which is a very important market for electronics, as I mentioned, we work closely with local civil society and trade union groups to try to understand the issues and try to understand what's going on and then try to remediate that, because we also want to improve conditions for suppliers. It's also part of getting them into the global supply chain. So, one of the things that we try to do is we strongly believe in continuous improvement. So all of these tools and programs that I mentioned that we developed, we're trying to get them to improve their conditions. So it's not just about figuring it out and then cutting them off, but actually bringing them up, I guess, towards this better way of working, more responsible business, if you will. So certainly trade unions play a critical role in that regard.
So I'm going to ask you a question, which I'm going to ask each panelist the same question as well, and that is, what role do you see in terms of for congressional action in terms of supporting multi-sectoral partnerships? I mean, if you see a role for us, what are the most important steps Congress could take to support the partnerships?
Well, I think just kind of taking a step back, you see it already. There are a multiplicity of initiatives battling trafficking, from the business point of view, from civil society, from governments around the world. We've heard it mentioned here today. So I think one of the key roles that the U.S. and Congress can play is trying to, as I mentioned, kind of bring them together as much as possible and scale them. I know the Global Fund is an interest to end trafficking and slavery. We heard Senator Corker last week testify at a hearing at a forum that we were speaking at as well, as a very promising and interesting idea. I think there are a number of other things that can be done along those lines, as well as engaging other countries as well. I mean, increasingly we are working with governments all over the world to do that. So I think the U.S. and Congress has a role to play in leading in that and sending a very clear signal that this is not only something that has to be rooted out here, but also globally, and that is not acceptable, and that we need to work together as we're doing, as you mentioned in this hearing.
Thank you. Mr. Gehring, could you describe and provide a couple of examples of IJM's work with law enforcement and judicial authorities Is it always successful, and does it vary by country? And what factors have to be in place for IJM to have the best outcomes? And I ask this because I wonder if there is anything we should be looking at or encouraging in judicial reform efforts abroad, anything that could help you with your work.
Thank you, Congressman. I think in all the countries that we work, there are shortcomings in the public justice system, right? We face problems with corruption in each of the countries that we work, and the IJM's model of running cases through the public justice system does require a certain threshold of functionality within countries that we choose to operate in. So in some countries where there's an immense need, may not have the infrastructure set up that we would be able to run cases through that. But I think that we have discovered that despite all the shortcomings and the challenges that exist in all the countries that we work, we are always able to find individuals of good faith who want to do their jobs well in those systems. And I think that's what's so important about doing individual cases through a criminal justice system, is you start to identify who the actors are that are taking their job seriously and wanting to do a good job, and which individuals are perhaps corrupt, perhaps the source of the block in the system. And then that allows you to make a pretty specific recommendation of, we need to remove this person because they're corrupt out of that position, and we need to put this person in their place because they're much better at their job. And I think that's just the value of doing individual cases, that you get a very, very accurate sense of what's working and what's not.
Yeah, and also encouraging a broken system to be unbroken. I mean, at the end of the day, you can't be there for every single case. We have to get these judicial systems to function so that even without advocacy, the people can go and get help.
Indeed, that is the end goal of all of our programs, is that eventually we're able to transfer ownership over to the governments, where they're taking more responsibility, more initiative on all of these cases, and people that IJM doesn't represent have a better experience through the criminal justice system.
And just the same question to you about what are the most important steps that we can take in Congress to support the partnerships that we're all talking about here today?
Well, I think Ms. Runlet had some very great recommendations on how Congress can support the Trafficking in Persons Office, especially through appropriations. They have
And I think in a bipartisan way we're doing better than the administration requested. So I feel we're trying to help.
They get their staff support from a certain account in the state foreign ops budget, and then also a grants budget. I would encourage all members of the commission to include in their appropriation requests high levels of funding for both out of diplomatic and consular programs, and also out of Title IV of INCL for their grants funding. Also, Ms. Runlet mentioned the programs to end modern slavery that the State Department is beginning to initiate. I think that has the opportunity to completely transform how civil society, governments, and the private sector are able to work in partnership to address this crime. This is designed to receive funding from other government sources and also from donations from the private sector, and I think it's just a unique opportunity to engage all actors in that system, and I would encourage Congress to fully fund the authorized amount of that.
Ms. Fabry, in your statement you mentioned the need for Customs and Border Patrol to clarify its evidentiary standards for opening an investigation, and for OMB to release a final definition of recruitment fees. Has Human Rights First developed specific recommendations or proposals in these two areas?
On the evidentiary standards, the law's pretty clear that it's reasonable suspicion. Former Commissioner Gil Kurlikowski, who was the head of CBP under the last administration, sits on our campaign ambassadors group. Mm-hmm. And he said, so he spent 9 years as the chief of police in Seattle, and said, if someone's home is burglarized, they're going to call 911, and law enforcement isn't going to say, can you tell us exactly who did it, and can they testify, which is sort of where we're at right now. But reasonable suspicion is a fairly low standard legally. So on that, we are just looking to enforce the law as it's written. On the federal procurement, yes, we have a public definition of what should be included in a recruitment fee. And again, there, I think, the final definition needs to be released in order for that to be effectively implemented and enforced. Along the lines of interagency collaboration, there's been sort of disjointed enforcement on that. There's been 0 cases, 0 allegations that have been investigated, but each agency is sort of off-floating on their own on this, and there's not coordinated training. There should be one forced labor expert or one office at least, that coordinates each of the agencies that do international government contracting, so that the procurement officers know what they're looking for.
And just finally, my last question to you is the same one, is just what recommendations do you have for us to, what are the most important steps that we can take to support partnerships the multi-sectoral partnerships that we're talking about here today?
I think, on both of the initiatives that we just talked about, on CBP better enforcing the Tariff Act and on federal procurement, Congress took steps on both of those cases. In terms of federal procurement, it was 5 years ago, and in terms of CBP, we're coming up on the 2-year mark in February. So I think anything Congress can do to encourage interagency coordination. CBP has no specific resources to enforce this part of the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act. So the President's budget request asked for an additional 20 auditors specifically to investigate forced labor. I don't know if 20 auditors is enough, but it's better than what they have right now, which is nothing. So,
thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, grateful for your testimony. A few questions, if I may. First, Mr. Busquet, I wonder if you could let me know a little bit more about, have other industries also reached out to hear what EICC has been doing, to maybe learn from you? What's your sense? Is there a broader appeal that's going on here? And I also wonder, within industry, if you're seeing some level of maybe whistleblower, I don't know if that's the right word or not, but someone, saying, hey, I'm concerned that some inappropriate activity might be happening here, or other things. Are you seeing any of that?
Sure. Thank you, Congressman, for that question. Actually, before I answer, I wanted to just echo Mr. Gearing's earlier comment on the need to support the TIP office. Also, the Department of Labor's iLab, as well, as a very important partner that we work very closely with. I want to signal their good work as well. Actually, that's a great question, Congressman. We've been very popular, so popular indeed that we are in the process of transitioning ourselves from an organization that started grounded in the electronics industry to now we are going to change our name officially in about a month and a half to become the Responsible Business Alliance. And this particularly is one because electronics is such a prevalent component of so many goods, but really more importantly is because other industries have been coming to us. So as the EICC, we have been taking on a number of other companies that are beyond the electronic space. We also work very closely with other similar bodies and associations in other industries and spaces here and abroad to inform them of what we do, share best practices, even have complementarity at some point. In fact, the Responsible Labor Initiative that I mentioned, the RLI, is meant to get at that. That is not only for electronics. It's meant to be, again, a multi-industry initiative just on trafficking and forced labor. And while it's still just getting off the ground, we launched it about a month and a half ago, it's getting at the exact point. So you are seeing sort of a natural convergence of a lot of companies sharing best practices. I think we've had the challenge, and it certainly is a challenge for the electronics industry, but it's one that we've been attacking and dealing with. So I think we've been able to develop some of these tools. In terms of your question on whistleblowers, I think that's what our programs put in place. It's not just, we have a very robust audit program. Our audit program is a third-party audit, so it's a series of audit firms with a fourth-party auditor that checks the auditors, if you will. But that's not really enough, and that's why I mentioned some of the tools that we're working on, which are things like worker grievance mechanisms, which allows management in factories, but also workers themselves, to come back and report back on what's going on. We've piloted a program in Malaysia in about 25 factories, 45,000 workers. We're hoping to scale that up moving forward and enter other markets. But that's a fundamental, having that kind of worker management dialogue, if you will, On these specific issues, you mentioned it's whistleblower, but it's very much important. It's not just about an audit. I mean, audit's a very important piece. And then the final point is flipping the business model, and that's where the labor agent certification, which will take a lot longer, but that's if we can actually create an incentive towards responsible recruitment, at least in terms of forced labor, we can basically maybe get at some of the root causes of this issue, but that'll take a while.
Can I ask you one more question? Just as far as your industry, your group, has there been much work in working with victims, rehabilitation of those who have been a part of forced labor, training maybe to be working in other areas? So I wonder, just as far as victim recovery and things.
Our approach has been more on the facility, if you will, and on the processes, but I know we're in discussions with IJM quite seriously in order about working together as we launch the RLI to developing that victim component. So I think that's something that we are going to see us building up over time, but principally we're still trying to get the procedures in place to both detect and to prevent it. We do a lot of training with sort of, I guess, preventive training with supplier factories and folks like that, so that they can actually understand how to implement some of these elements in their operations.
Mr. Gearing, thanks. Good to have you here. I want to thank you as well. You took some time this summer to meet with my staff. One of the things that we've done over the last few years is have kind of a book club in our staff, and the one that we chose this year was The Locust Effect, that I know you were a part of doing a lot of the research on that and working with Gary Haugen in writing that, and appreciated you taking time to meet with the staff. We also had our big group of interns that were in. It was really a powerful discussion that we had. First, I mean, reading through the book, of seeing the impact of violence and lack of law enforcement and functioning legal systems, especially for those who suffer under poverty. So I appreciate so much your work there. I wonder if you could just, kind of following up on that, just talk a little bit more of maybe where you are encouraged of areas that IGM or other partnerships have been able to come in, where if you don't even have that basic level of law enforcement, or if people in a population, the last person they would want to go to when they have problems is the police or is the courts. How have you addressed that? And maybe if you can give us an example from what IGM has seen of some hope that as difficult as that situation is, as challenging as that is. And then I guess maybe just what our role as Congress ought to be, I guess, to be pushing and encouraging and helping. And is it financing? Is it other things that they need in order to have these legal systems that really do function to be able to help these people?
Thank you, Congressman. Your question on good examples and stories of hope is a good one. I think I'd like to specifically highlight our work in the Philippines. The Philippines is one of the first field offices that IJM opened. For about 12 or 15 years, we addressed the commercial sexual exploitation of children. And we worked there, again, doing our model, very closely with police, very closely with prosecutors, with the courts and the aftercare systems to run these cases through and to provide, to make the system work for individuals. And we have seen the Philippines government make tremendous progress and take much needed ownership of addressing that issue. So much so that we've transitioned from our type of casework that we focus on in the Philippines. We now work on online sexual exploitation of children. But we have seen that the government has been able to be effective and sustainable in the gains that they've made on keeping children safe. And I think one of the things that immediately comes to mind when you talk about the Philippines is other human rights abuses that we've heard of, especially the past 6 months in the Philippines. And I think this is an important point to hone in on, is that the Philippines government and the anti-trafficking units that they set up were able to, that they've been able to protect their children without solving every single human rights abuse in the country. the Philippines government still has an enormous amount of progress that they need to make, especially on the extrajudicial killings that are getting so much attention, especially on the drug war. But they have been able to make progress on this one subset of criminal activity, and I think that's progress that needs to be highlighted and needs to be identified, and they deserve credit for that. One of the things that I think that Congress should do, I mentioned the financial support for the Trafficking in Persons Office, but as you know, the House passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act earlier this summer, and I think the way that we've seen, the reason we've seen that bill in particular be so effective in the ways that other human rights legislation has not been, is because of the oversight and involvement of Congress in that. And I think so. I would encourage members of Congress to continue with high levels of appropriations for the Trafficking in Persons Office on their grants and on their staffing. But also, it just makes it makes a very big difference when, for example, in the Senate, when nominees are coming up to get through confirmation hearings, if questions are being asked about that, when you meet with government officials who are coming in from other countries to talk about a wide array of issues, it matters when you bring these issues of trafficking and forced labor up. So I would encourage you to keep that in mind as you have those official meetings.
Thanks. One more thing, Mr. Gehring, if I could. I know in the work with IJM, you see all different circumstances. I know many times the abuse, the forced labor, trafficking is an evil individual who is looking to use somebody else for illicit purposes. I know other times too there is larger criminal organizations that are involved in this. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that when that larger criminal organization is uncovered, does the role of partnerships, does it still work, or is that the point where you just kind of have to hand it over to government entities to be working at that point?
Yeah, I think in the experience of our casework, it mostly is individuals who are exploiting very vulnerable people in these populations. I think what we've seen is that when there is and it's a very sort of rational business calculation, when the risk of something goes up, the prevalence of the crime goes down. From our experience, we haven't had increased engagement with these larger criminal networks that I would be able to speak to.
Ms. Fabry, thank you. Wonder if in your testimony you talked about really that human rights is both a moral obligation and is also vital for U.S. national security. Wonder if you could speak a little bit more from a human rights perspective on how combating human trafficking aligns with both our values and our interests, and how this perspective serves to strengthen anti-trafficking partnerships across sectors.
Thank you. That's a great question. I think from human rights first perspective, we have really prioritized working with what might seem like unusual allies in lots of our work. Our national security team, which looks at the intersection of national security issues and human rights, has a large group of retired military leaders that we've partnered with for over 10 years now, particularly around closing Guantanamo and looking at the use of torture and interrogation. And it's the success of that model that we tried to take to our human trafficking campaign when we launched a few years ago, in pulling together a really diverse group of campaign ambassadors, that some of whom had worked on trafficking for a long time, and some of whom really knew very little about the issue but had relationships with the organization. And so we've, I think, been able to bring a number of new allies into the fight against human trafficking. And those folks have really helped us identify areas where there weren't enough partnerships. In particular, we have been looking at the low rate of prosecutions here in the United States. We partner with some local states' attorneys in a couple of areas. We work with local mayors. We have built partnerships with local law enforcement and also some of the U.S. attorneys' offices across the country, and really identified that the areas that we're seeing the most successful prosecutions were ones where they all knew each other, where the local law enforcement was well synced up with the federal law enforcement. And in many cases, literally, they physically sit in the same building and have gotten to know each other really well and built those relationships personally. So it's that approach that we've seen a lot of success in, and have proposed. There's legislation that has already passed the House that includes a provision that would designate a human trafficking specific prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office who would be responsible for coordinating amongst all of the local law enforcement, but also with victim service providers in those areas. I think, that model, once it's up and running, our anticipation is that would be replicable internationally. It would be a good model for us to, for the U.S. to lead on and to take overseas.
Great. You've mentioned a few different pieces of legislation that has passed, either been introduced or passed this session or last session, and I'm encouraged among my colleagues of the focus and the reality, again, that this is not a partisan issue, that this is something that brings us together. We've seen both the House and the Senate act on important pieces of legislation, I think taking steps in the right direction. Wonder, from your perspective, if there's any gaps of things that you feel like, and I think I know you mentioned earlier too, just some of the oversight that needs to happen to make sure that enforcement is followed through, especially with some of the border issues. But is there any place else, gaps in legislation that you think from Human Rights First that there ought to be a bill or there ought to be a law that maybe we could get started as well?
That's a great question. I think it's already an existing bill. But the biggest gap we've seen on the prosecution side, other than needing a designated person, has been resources. The Trafficking Prosecution Unit at DOJ has been flat funded at $5.3 million for 7 years now. They've managed, despite the flat funding, to increase their caseload by 62% in that time frame, in part because they've learned how to do these cases and they've built that muscle, and so they're able to do them a little bit more quickly. They've built better relationships. But they can't do more with the same amount forever. So I would encourage members of the commission to support additional funding for the Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit. It's a very small office within the Civil Rights Division, and they don't get as much attention as they deserve.
I agree. Thanks. Maybe one last question, and this has been talked about, but if I can just ask each of you as kind of our conclusion question, and if you want to, focus on something else just for the last minute or two, that would be great as well. But just really would, I guess, have one last request from your experience of partnerships and how important they are in combating human trafficking. What else do you need? What do you feel like is the biggest thing that is it? Again, it could be from us, it could be from other partners, and so for you to take the next step, your entity, what do you need? So.
Well, I think thank you very much for that question, Congressman. I think in order to take the next step, obviously, to, as I mentioned in my testimony, to achieve scale, I think there are a number of things. I mean, one thing that has been very valuable for us is to engage foreign governments. I mean, in the process of the TPP negotiations, we worked very closely with the embassy and USTR and the State Department with the Malaysian government. And Malaysia had a policy that was charging recruitment fees to foreign migrant workers, and this was obviously they were finding themselves in an indebted situation, and working closely and having that help from the U.S. government and that leadership. And there were a number of congressional delegations I know that met with our office over there and went to the country, helped open up quite a lot of things and helped deal with that. So I use that as an example, but I think kind of, engaging at least in some of these markets that are very much difficult, I think that's certainly something that can be very valuable. And then I guess, these programs do need support. So, again, re-echoing the support to some of the offices that are doing such a great job, as well as with international partners such as the ILO and others that can help scale this. I mean, business, I think, more and more, and obviously can't speak for all companies, but more and more, certainly the ones that make our coalition, but also other ones as well, they want to act and they're ready to act. They can't do it alone, but they want to work with you. So I think just creating those opportunities would be great.
Thanks, Mr. Gearing.
I want to come back to one thing that Ms. Runlet mentioned, and then I also mentioned, but I really want to stress the importance of the State Department's programs to end modern slavery. This is, I think, just an unprecedented opportunity to bring in not only the U.S. government, not only other donor governments, but host governments as well, who will take ownership of that, as well as with the private sector, as well as with civil societies who take a range of different approaches of addressing this. I think this is an opportunity to get unprecedented resources and unprecedented collaboration in this. From IJM's perspective, this is the thing that is needed to take our work to the next scale. We would just, again, ask members of Congress to fully fund the appropriation of that and to push the administration to enforce it.
Thanks. Ms. Favory?
I know we've already talked about the need for oversight. I think, you know, in lots of instances, additional regulation is helpful to bring additional players to the table. In this case, we've got some really good regulations and some really good laws. The Tariff Act ban on imports made with forced labor has the potential to be a game changer to level the playing field for responsible businesses that are doing the right thing. And we just need better enforcement on these things. There could be additional transparency requirements for the agencies that are enforcing these. And Congress, I think, you know, could be really effective in pushing both the agencies that are enforcing this ban and also the agencies that are responsible for enforcing our federal procurement, ensuring that the U.S. Government isn't directly funding trafficking through our government contracts.
Thank you. Thanks. Appreciate your thoughts and input. Look forward to staying in communication. And there is, as you can sense, you know, a desire for us to be working together to continue to try and end human trafficking as soon as possible. And so thankful for what you all are doing. With that, we will end this hearing and adjourn. Thank you very much.